Let's bring in Guy Benson, obviously the host of the Guy Benson Show on Fox Radio. Guy, we're just learning the breaking news of the former Vice President Dick Cheney is dead at the age of 84. What's your reaction this morning?
Well, my heart goes out to the Cheney family. This was a giant on our political scene for many years. I mean, Ainsley, you just walked through the resume, or at least part of the resume, and it's extraordinary. This life, this American life that he led: White House Chief of Staff, Member of Congress, Defense Secretary, Vice President of the United States. I remember at the time, and even now, a lot of people observe that Cheney perhaps was one of the most influential and powerful vice presidents in the history of the country. And Brian, you mentioned his legacy on same-sex marriage, a real leader in the Republican Party on that. When it was not popular to come out for that position, he did so. He stood by it under some withering controversy and questions about it. My biggest memory of Cheney, there is one joke that he made. I was an intern at the White House during the Bush administration, and they gathered all the interns in one day, and Cheney, sort of this enigmatic figure, came in for the photograph and left almost immediately, and President Bush was going to stay and answer our questions, and Cheney said, "Ask him tough questions," and sort of chuckled and then shuffled off to go do whatever he was up to, a very busy man. But I think that the Bush team brought him in as the running mate in 2000 because George W. Bush, although the son of a president, was seen still as rather inexperienced. Voters might have wondered, okay, here's the son of a president. Is this person up for the job? Obviously, he ended up being president for 2 full terms, but there was a sense that he needed gravitas on the ticket, and that was a term used over and over again attached to Cheney. And as I was coming up in politics and paying attention to such things now decades ago, which is sort of amazing to think about, I think back to Cheney's performance in the vice presidential debate against John Edwards in 2004. John Kerry, John Edwards, the Democrats, making a big push to try to stop President Bush from getting reelected. And those two men sat down together, Edwards and Cheney. And I remember afterwards, the analysis, the polling, especially among women, was that in a post 9/11 world, Cheney was calm. He spoke very quietly but authoritatively with a deep voice, and he reassured a lot of voters this person in this administration is in charge and they need to remain in office. And I think he had a not small effect on the re-election victory for sure in 2004. So what a life, and condolences to Cheney's family. A very long life, despite those heart issues that he had. I remember there was a joke from, I think, Conan O'Brien, the comedian, when they were first running in 2000. George W. Bush, a recovering alcoholic, didn't drink, so he referred to the Republican ticket that year, Conan O'Brien did, as no liquor, bad ticker. That was sort of the joke, and that was decades ago, and thank God through medical innovation, Cheney was able to get the care that he needed to end up living for decades to come, as I said, an extraordinary American life.
Yeah, I mean, he's somebody, as vice president, reassured the American public that if you elect George W. Bush with no international experience, that everything's going to be okay. But he had the dual thing of saying, okay, I might have been Secretary of Defense for George H.W. Bush, and now I'm working side by side with his son. But his son wanted to distinguish himself as somebody who's not going to be just a replica of his dad or run by his dad's people. He had to have his own identity. And I think the vice president was aware of that. While at the same time, a lot of his influence was under the wire because he did not want to take any perceived power from the young president who was governor of Texas. So you agree, Guy?
Definitely. And if you remember back in the 2000 campaigns, George W. Bush was running in the Republican primary, not as a full-blown non-interventionist, but kind of saying, you know, we don't need to be the world's policeman. We don't need to be running around all over the world getting into various entanglements. I'm paraphrasing there. Of course, everything changed on the 11th of September 2001 when the Bush administration had to pivot immediately to a massive threat, a mass murder of Americans on our soil, and the foreign policy decisions that were made, many of which kept us safe for years, by the way, remain controversial to this day, absolutely part of the Cheney legacy that people will debate and discuss in the coming days. But yeah, an influential figure within that administration for all the reasons that you just mentioned.
You know, Guy, it's such a good point, and it's a point that you got to talk about because it's a part of his legacy, and that was the enhanced interrogation that he believed in and actually helped with a lot of the operations there. And he went to his political grave by saying this was necessary. You didn't see the stuff that we saw of people trying to kill America. And at that time, we were at war and we needed all the information we could to stop future Americans from dying.
Yeah, and a lot of the critics said, well, this is torture. And Cheney and others said, no, it's not. Remember the White House legal office, legal counsel, drafting all sorts of memos. That was one of the controversies of the Bush administration. There was a former CIA official whose name is escaping me. It might be Jose Rodriguez. Don't quote me on that. But he wrote a book, if I'm not mistaken, called Hard Measures, where he defended enhanced interrogation and talked about specific instances. How did this work? How did this keep Americans safe and help protect the homeland after that 9/11 atrocity? I mean, those were debates that were being had basically in real time. They very much impacted the 2004 election, 2002, of course, and then 2006 and the flip to the Democrats in 2008. And I suspect in the wake of the former vice president's death now, we will reignite that controversy and that debate.
Yeah, I mean,
and I think it's still an important one.
Guy, we grew up. I mean, don't you remember? I was right out of college when he was serving, when he won. It was Bush and Cheney. Remember all the signs, the red, white, and blue signs and all the T-shirts? And they were running against Al Gore and Lieberman. And then they ran the second term against John Kerry and John Edwards. John Edwards went through all of that controversy personally. But when you're right about how he had that soft but heavy and deep voice, so when you heard him speak, you really wanted to listen. He was very bright. And what were some personal stories that you remember growing up and him serving our country?
I mean, definitely we just talked about those two elections, formative elections. I mean, think about the 2000 election, right, which went forever. And the recount in Florida and sort of the craziness there and all the protests and the dueling Supreme Court rulings in Florida, then up in Washington, D.C. I mean, by the skin of their teeth, Bush and Cheney got elected. And that ended up being such a consequential election just months later with the attacks of 9/11 that I think ultimately define the response to which define the Bush presidency. And you mentioned, Ainsley, the 2000 election. Isn't it interesting how politics can work sometimes? Dick Cheney, running as the Republican nominee for vice president and then a GOP vice president for 8 years, in recent years has become more critical of the party in certain ways. Of course, we know his daughter, Liz, very critical of former President Trump. The opponent in the 2000 race, running with Al Gore, Joe Lieberman, ended up endorsing and campaigning for John McCain, the Republican, against Barack Obama in 2008. So politics can take some fascinating twists and turns, and that was very much true in the life of Dick Cheney.
So Dick Cheney, for a number of reasons, was controversial, but it didn't seem to bother him. In fact, I think in many ways he seemed to thrive under it, and it definitely influenced how he approached 2000. Remember, after the first Persian Gulf War, the critics were saying that George H.W. Bush should have finished the job. He should have knocked him out of Baghdad. And we wouldn't have this problem because we had a problem ever since the Persian Gulf War ended. Saddam Hussein violated everything he signed off on. He would kick out inspectors. He would put down and gas when the Shia rose up to overthrow him, and we did not back him. So that's in the back of Dick Cheney's mind leading up to 2000. And then when they go in and the inspectors initially had access, they realized he was much further along on his weapons of mass destruction than we even thought. So as he kicks out inspectors, that's in the back of the vice president's mind. Well, look at how he was lying the first time. If he's kicking out inspectors this time, he's probably even hiding even more than he ever had before. So they have intelligence. It comes together. Colin Powell presents it to the United Nations. The Saddam Hussein doesn't back off. He doubles down. We have the invasion, but it was which one fine. But it's the post-occupation that was the issue. And that was where a lot of the critics came forward. We had to end up in an urban warfare that nobody really wanted, that people were hoping we wouldn't be involved in. But then we end up changing tactics and thriving again. And Dick Cheney brought everyone through that, and he was managed to, along with George W. Bush, get reelected. These were tough decisions that he was very secure in what he knew, the experience that he brought. And after he made them, he was more than willing to stand behind them, even to his last day.
Yeah, and he was very much a force behind the scenes. He was not a terribly public-facing vice president. He didn't have a ton of personality flair in the traditional sense, but behind the scenes, He worked diligently. He knew what buttons to push and where. He was extremely powerful, extremely influential, and he could get a little colorful. I do remember there was an episode, I believe, on the Senate floor where he let some people know. I believe there were some mouth readers, lip readers, who saw that he was unhappy with some senators, and I believe dropped a certain word on the Senate floor at one point, which sparked perhaps my favorite column by our former colleague, our late colleague, Charles Krauthammer of all time, in defense of the F word. That was a Dick Cheney incident. It's a fabulous column that maybe would be worth a read today in memory of Charles. And I bet Dick Cheney would say in memory of him, too. I bet you he was a fan of that column.
Of course he was. And he also was a big proponent of defense spending. And there were many times where he took on the other party, not only when he was Secretary of Defense, but when he was Vice President. And he kept reminding them, they just don't get it. They don't get the threat here. We have to invest in our military, Guy.
Of course, and that view was, I think, pre-existing 9/11. He probably would argue absolutely vindicated on 9/11. And then the decisions that were made looking ahead to the years and decades to come. I mean, the legacy of 9/11 and how the Bush administration chose to respond to it is likely the foremost legacy of Vice President Cheney. I mean, we're talking about different facets and aspects of his life, a family man, all these positions that he held,
Right.
his stances on certain issues, his electoral benefit to President Bush. But post 9/11 America, for good or for ill or some combination thereof, that is the legacy of this man who's just passed away. Thank God at a ripe old age after all those hard issues that he suffered through and survived, frankly, for many years.
All right. Thanks, Guy. I appreciate the insight.
I'm Steve Doocy.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.